It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm going to be your host walking you through the first part of our show today. We're going to start with the recap of last night's action in the daily fantasy community, move on to a little bit of a report about today's weather, what we have coming up there. We'll talk a little bit about some of the Vegas lines and some of the things that we see, some of the outliers that we noticed from there. We'll go on and talk about pitching. I'll bring on Josh Kalachi, my co-host and our pitching guru here at RotoCurve. We'll try to help you guys stay on some of the pitchers, the right pitchers for tonight, so you can win in your cash games and have a chance to take down some of those big tournaments. After that, we'll move on to the hitters. We're going to get into a little bit of a teaching point today. We had a forum question this week that asked us, I always hear you guys talk about GPP plays versus cash game plays. And, I'm still a little confused on what that is. So I'm going to try to break it down a little bit further for you, give you guys a little bit of the things that we look for to differentiate between a GPP play and the cash game play. So guys you'd use in your tournaments and guys you'd use in your head-to-heads, your 50-50, things like that on whatever site you're playing on. After that, we'll move on to the end. We'll finish talking about hitters. And then Josh and I will give you our cornerstones, the guys that we think we have to have in our lineup tonight and we have to build around. But before we actually get into that, I wanted to bring Josh on. For those of you who don't know, Josh is a big Phillies fan. And today we have a prospect watch that we wanted to talk about real quick. Maikel Franco, third baseman for the Philadelphia Phillies, was just called up. So, Josh, you want to give people a little bit of a rundown on him?
Yeah, I heard you talk about how I'm a big Phillies fan, and that used to mean a lot more. Of course, we used to be a pretty good team, 08, 09, but kind of faded down a little bit, and that's because there haven't been a lot of good prospects. But there is now a guy coming up by the name of Maikel Franco, the third baseman. They played him at first a little bit in the minor leagues, and he's a good guy to look at because we've seen guys like Chris Bryant come up. We saw Addison Russell come up. Javier Baez hopefully will be coming up before too long with the Cubs. But what we're going to see with a prospect is you always see the hype. You always see the high prices on daily fantasy sites, which Franco is very priced pretty highly today. I think Benny was saying he's over 4,000 on DraftKings or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think he's like 4,000 on DraftKings, if I'm not mistaken, and like 35 on FanDuel or something. Like I got a little excited when I heard him coming up because I know he's got a little bit of pop in his bat. His slash lines hadn't been great in AAA. For those of you who don't know, his slash lines is basically his numbers, his batting average, his on-base percentage. They put them together with a slash. That's why they call them slash lines. But like I said, for that price, there are a lot of other guys who are a little more proven who I think I'd rather go with today. I don't know. Are you using him at all today? Like I said, I like him. I know he's got upside. He's got power, but I kind of want to take a wait and see approach with him, to be honest.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do as well because like you said, with that price point, you can get guys like Kyle Seager. You can get guys like you can only spend a few more $100 on DraftKings and get Matt Carpenter. Like it's not worth taking a shot on a guy that's really an unknown commodity. And the reason I say that is because he came up last September. He's had 2 spring trainings, and he hasn't proven his ability to hit major league pitching. And that's the big difference between when a guy's coming up through the minor leagues. He's single A. If a guy rakes, double A, he rakes, triple A, he rakes. That doesn't always mean he's going to hit in the majors because the talent difference between triple A and the major leagues is huge. I know these guys have to make their way through the order, but if a guy hits 30 home runs and hits 340 in the minors, that doesn't mean he's going to do anything in the major leagues. And unfortunately, that's what happened with Don Brown, other than that 1 month of July 2 years ago. So I'm going to take a wait-and-see approach with Franco. He does have incredible power. I can't lie about that. He's probably going to be a nice option against left-handed pitching if he can stay later on in the season. But for right now, for this one day, I'm going to stay away from him. And if he does hit 2 home runs, great. That means he's a good target in the future if he can keep his numbers up. But I'm not willing to take a risk on an unknown commodity, especially at that price when you can get someone like a Matt Carpenter or a Kyle Seager for just a little bit more.
Yeah, and another thing, too, for you guys to remember, as great as all those guys that Josh mentioned that came up for the Cubs are, what's the one thing we always say about the Cubs? Right now with all those young bats in their lineup, there might be more home runs. Chris Bryant gets a hold of one. He can hit it out of the ballpark. But at the same point in time, he also probably is going to finish that game like, 1 for 4 with 2 strikeouts. So the young guys, when they're coming up, yeah, they might have a lot of pop, they might have a lot of upside, but they also have a lot of strikeout with them. So, there's that to watch out for too. If a team brings up a lot of rookies, it's usually a chance that there's going to be a lot of strikeouts in that lineup as well. But again, like you said, whenever we see these new guys popping up on the radar, we want to let you know about them, because right now I think Cody Ashley is basically the third baseman for the Phillies. You got to think they're going to give this kid Franco a couple shots to see what he can do. So he's a guy that, right now we want you to put him on your radar. But again, for tonight, I don't think he's somebody that I'm going to have in my lineup. But again, if he hits 2 home runs and, turns out to be the stud that everyone kind of expects him to be at some point in his career, then you know what, I'll be on him on some other night, but it won't be tonight. So speaking of tonight, I mean, that was just something we wanted to throw out there for you with the prospect watch. We're going to get into a little bit of a recap of last night first, and then we'll move on to some of the things that we see for today. Yesterday, we had a split slate yesterday. There was an afternoon slate and an evening slate. Went pretty formful, if you ask me. A lot of the guys who, were highly owned went out there and performed like we expected them to. There wasn't a lot of pitchers that got blown up that we didn't think they would. Gio Gonzalez didn't have a good game in the early slate. Doug Fister didn't have a good one in the late slate, so pitching for Washington was a little bit messed up. But the late slate last night, we gave you guys, for those of you who were in the chatting with us before the games went off, we basically said Cueto and Hutchinson were the 2 guys that we really liked. They both had pretty good games. I was a little upset because the bullpens blew the wins for both of them. So they both finished with about 24 DraftKings points, I think, somewhere in that range. Should have been 28 or 29 if they would have got the wins. But, I mean, hey, that's baseball. That happens sometimes. Again, all you can do is pick the starting pitcher who you think is going to have the best game and, hope everything works out for him. So those are 2 guys that we gave you in chat that pitched pretty well yesterday. Tyson Ross didn't have a horrible game. He was all right. Again, I mean, Hutchinson as the number 2, I think, was better because he was cheaper. And, basically, I think he outscored Ross by a couple points. It was pretty close. Wasn't anything, anything spectacular that your bats couldn't have made up for you. But, again, it is always nice to have the highest scoring guys. Couple other guys that we talked about in chat yesterday, guys like Willen Rosario. Again, Rosario is, Walt Weiss hates him, so he doesn't get a lot of playing time. Walt Weiss actually sent him down to AAA at one point this year. But the one thing Rosario does very well is he's a big right-handed bat with some power, and he hits left-handed pitching. Whenever the Rockies are playing an interleague game where they get to use a DH, if they're going up against a lefty, a lot of times Rosario is going to be that DH. He's going to be hitting somewhere in the 4 or 5 spot in that order. And, he went yard yesterday, so that was a good, cheap option at catcher that a lot of people had that listened to us. Another guy we threw out there, we basically said that, depending on how the lineup comes out, you got to look at the guys like Solarte and Spangenberg. I did not expect Spangenberg to hit 2 home runs, but I was very pleasantly surprised that I had him in a couple of my lineups. I was hoping for a couple hits out of him, maybe a couple runs scored. But, hey, you're never going to argue with a guy who has 2 home runs. I think he had 26 DraftKings points, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a huge return for a guy who's under $4,000. He's eligible at a couple positions, too. I think you could put him in there at second and short or second and third or something on DraftKings. So he was a big play if you had him in your lineup. I had him in a GPP or 2. I did not have him in cash games. I didn't think he was a cash game play, but hey, you know what? Anybody can go off on any given day. We always talk about that. Derek Norris. Derek Norris was another guy in that San Diego game who had a big game. He hit a home run, a 3-run home run. I think he ended up with about 5 RBIs, 2 or 3 hits, 32 DraftKings points for Norris last night. So, I mean, as much as Willen Rosario was a good cost saver, Norris wasn't all that much more expensive than he was, and he had a monster game. So that was another good one. Edwin Encarnacion, Joey Bats, those guys hit home runs. We talked about the Toronto stack in chat as well, how, we felt they were in a good spot. A couple of those guys are expensive. I mean, you're never going to get Joey Bats or Edwin Encarnacion for cheap into your lineup. But there were some other cheap options like Colabello and Kevin Pillar, who you could have put in there with them and made a stack work if you were playing in tournaments or something. So that's a lot of it. As you know, last night, one of the weirdest things I saw last night was in that San Diego and Washington game. They started the game. Tyson Ross pitched to one batter, and then they had another rain delay, which is pretty much the worst possible thing. I sat here. I had a little bit of Ross, and I sat here all night saying to myself, please allow this game to get back on. Please allow this game to get back on. Because to pitch to one batter and then to sit, if that rain delay was a little bit longer, I mean, there's a good chance that they might have just said to Tyson Ross, you know what, just sit out the night. You know, we'll give you a day off tomorrow, and then we'll throw you in on Sunday and, you know, let you warm up and go, you know, your usual 100, 110 pitches on Sunday. So that was a little bit of a hairy situation for me. I thought I was going to wind up with 1 point out of Ross and one batter pitch to, and then walk away. But, you know, last night I actually fell asleep before all the games ended because of the delay. And then by the time they did play it and finish it, you know, luckily if you had guys there, you know, guys like Norris, guys like Spangenberg, you know, even some of the guys like Upton, you know, they all went off. They all had pretty good games. So that wasn't too bad a situation for you. But anyway, speaking of weather, let's move on tonight and talk about some of the weather situations. There are 2 games in the Midwest that we got to be concerned about. The New York Yankees at the Kansas City Royals tonight, 72% chance of rain. That's the biggest risk. It's still way too early to tell at this point. You know, if you look at some of the projections from now, there seems that they're going to be a steady rain for most of the night. Doesn't look like there's like an actual window where the rain's going to stop for a couple hours to let them get the game in. But again, I mean, it's, you know, 12 o'clock Eastern time right now. That game isn't until 7 or 8 o'clock at night Eastern time. So there's a lot can happen with those projections between now and then. The rain could come early. The rain could clear out. It could go north or south of the stadium and just miss it. So basically, I just wanted to mention it to you. The Yankees in Kansas City, 72% chance of rain. So definitely check on that if you're planning on using any of those guys in your lineup tonight. The other game in Missouri is St. Louis and Detroit. That's a 60% chance of rain. It's in St. Louis as well, so not far off. And again, it's another one of those things that we kind of gotta keep our eye on. That one looks like it has a better chance of getting in. The percentage of rain is a little bit less, and it also seems to be spotty, you know, where there'll be like rain for maybe an hour, then it looks like it's going to clear up for a little bit, and maybe some more rain later on towards the end of the game. But that one I'm a little less fearful of getting in. But again, you still got to keep an eye on it. Detroit and St. Louis, if there's any of the bats, or I don't really think there's much pitching in either one of these 2 games that I want to be on. You know, a guy like Pineda is a good choice, but he's got a tough matchup today. A guy like Carlos Martinez, I just don't trust anymore. Shane Green's not been great. So I don't think we have to worry too much about the pitching. There shouldn't be too many guys that are on some of these pitchers tonight. But definitely want to you know, just have that in mind if you are going to put some of these bats in your lineup. As far as wind goes, there are a couple situations today which are really important for me to make sure you guys understand. Whenever the wind is blowing out in Wrigley Field, that's always a huge boost to the run scoring line, and it's also a huge boost to the, you know, to the hitters. Right now, the wind is blowing out about 9 miles an hour straight out to center field in Chicago and Wrigley Field. Now, here's why that's important. We always talk to you guys about the, you know, the Vegas lines and the line movements. That game opened up with a run line of 8. And once everybody saw the wind, Vegas has moved it up already today to 9.5. And I wouldn't be shocked to see if it gets over 10. The way Wrigley Field is built, the wind is a big factor in Wrigley. So if anybody gets one of those balls and lifts it up in the air, you know, there's a good chance that ball is going to carry out for a home run. You know, they don't call Chicago the windy city for nothing. I mean, the wind over there is a legitimate factor. And, you know, again, when the wind is blowing dead out to center field, we have seen some, you know, a lot of home runs hit and some high run games be scored. And, you know, Vegas, like I said, they didn't build those casinos that big because they don't know what they're doing. There's a reason Vegas jumped this run line by almost 2 runs already today. And again, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised to see it climb even a little bit higher. So if you're looking at anybody in that Chicago Cubs and Pirates game, you got to give all the batters a little bit of a tick up and all the pitchers a little bit of a tick down, basically based on that wind. It's going to be a factor today. Definitely something you guys should consider when you're building your rosters. The other 2 games that have some wind, Oakland has wind blowing 15 miles an hour straight out to center field. There's also some wind blowing in that Dodgers game as well, which is also in that, you know, up in that same area over there in California. And the Oakland game with the wind blowing 15 miles an hour out, yes, I think that helps, but I don't think it helps a ton because that's a really big ballpark. So even with the wind blowing out, it's still not an easy place to hit the ball out of. But again, it's, you know, like we say, it's something that you want to consider with your guys. If there's 2 guys you're choosing between, maybe that's the thing that pushes you over the edge, but it's not something that's going to make me start liking guys that I haven't liked. If there's somebody in that game that you like, sure, it's an added bonus to it, but I'm not going to go out there and just roster everybody in that game because the wind is blowing out. Whereas in the Cubs-Pittsburgh game, I definitely think that, you know, you might want to make sure you include a couple of those guys. because you know at Wrigley that 10-mile-an-hour winds blowing out is a huge factor. The only other game where wind might be an issue is the game down in Texas, and this is the opposite issue. The wind is actually blowing straight into the hitter's face in this game at about 12 miles an hour, which is a significant amount. The reason why it's a big deal is this is a game that we'll get into with the Vegas lines. It's one of the highest over-under games on the day. It has a 9-run total, which was the highest before the line movement in that Chicago and Pittsburgh game. So basically in that Cleveland, Texas game, there were a lot of bats that I think people were on early. And I think that some people are starting to back off of them because of the wind in their face, which again, if there's a guy that you liked and you thought he was going to be a good play, he's probably still a good play. He's just probably not as good a play because his home run potential is probably lessened a little bit. So that's the weather issues for today. Like I said, we're going to move on to the Vegas lines now. We talked a little bit about that Cleveland and Texas game already. The other game I wanted to mention was the Chicago Cubs game. We talked a little bit about that already, how the line had moved from 8 to 9.5 with the wind blowing out to center field. That's a really big deal for them. We have a couple games today that have low totals, so that's good. That's where we want to look for a lot of our pitching. One of the big things that jumped out to me right away, Bartolo Colon is a -150 favorite, which I thought was a little bit high, but he's at home in Citi Field, and he pitches very well in Citi Field. Citi Field is a really tough park for hitters, so the pitchers tend to do really well over there. And, with Bartolo being a big favorite, again, I can't explain to you how he does what he does, but, he just keeps winning. He just keeps striking people out. He keeps putting that fastball in the exact spots that he wants to put it in. And, so far this season, it's worked out pretty well for him. The last Vegas line I want to mention, something that really popped out to me, and this will bring us into our starting pitching for the day as well. Clayton Kershaw is a -300 favorite today. That is one of the biggest favorites I have seen all season so far, and they're basically expecting him to go out there and dominate. Now, that's also a 6.5 total run line. Dodger Stadium is not a place that gives up a lot of runs, as we have mentioned in the past. So they're basically expecting Kershaw to go out there and be every bit of the stud that we think of him as in daily fantasy. So this could be a great spot for Kershaw. Again, we're going to move on to the starting pitchers. And, as you guys know, Kershaw is basically my number one today, if you can't tell by the way I'm talking. Listen, I don't need to get into how good this guy is and all his numbers and everything like that. You guys already know. Here's what's important for him is where do you use him and where do you don't use him tonight. So let's get in and talk about that a little bit, because that's really, the gist behind this show is, who do we like tonight and how can we help you guys make some money in daily fantasy. If you're playing in cash games tonight, I definitely think Kershaw is a guy that you want on your rosters. He looks to be the safest bet. He's easily the guy who has the highest win probability. He's got the lowest run total in his game. You know that he can strike guys out. He does it all the time. He's one of the best pitchers in baseball. Cy Young's, strikeout crowns. Basically any stat that you would want to look at for pitching to show you that a guy's a stud, he's got them all lined up. So when you're playing in your cash games, whether it be on FanDuel, whether it be on DraftKings, whether it be over on Fantasy Aces, I think Kershaw's a guy that you got to include in there. And on a night like tonight, I think it's good because there are a lot of pitchers who are reasonably priced towards that middle or lower tier today that you could pair up with Kershaw and still give yourself enough money where at most you might have to take one cheap bat, but you can still get a whole bunch of those guys in the 35 to 4,500 range, fit them into your lineup along with Kershaw and a second pitcher who, we'll talk about some of the guys that you can look at today, who's in that 5K to 7K range, who can give you that 20, 25 point upside. So as long as you can get that kind of upside P2, there's no problem with putting Kershaw in. I think he's the stud of studs today. He's far and away the number one for me on the board. And, again, I don't have to tell you guys how good this guy is. If you want to look at his stats, you can look at his stats. Normally I throw all these stats out there, but it doesn't really make a difference with Kershaw. He's that good. ERA is low. His whip is low. His strikeouts are high. There's a reason why he costs $11,000, $12,000 on some of these sites and, is the top price pitcher on the day. So that's basically number one. So we got Kershaw out of the way. He's the number one. But here's where things get a little interesting. There are a lot of options for pitching today. I would say there's at least 5 or 6 guys that I've been kicking around as SP2s that I could use in cash, in GPPs, in tournaments. There's a lot of different ways you can go with it today. I think lineups, when they come out, are going to be something that pushes me one way or another onto some of these guys. But I'm going to give you a quick rundown of a couple of the guys I've been looking at, and then I'm going to throw it over to Josh because he's been on the money with pitching lately. So, if you're going to listen to anybody, I would say listen to him over me. But I'm still going to give you my 2 cents anyway right now. Another guy who I really like is J.A. Happ. Happ pitches for Seattle, goes up against Boston today. Boston, surprisingly, has the worst batting average in the league against left-handed pitching. They are hitting about 185 right now against left-handers so far this season. That is incredibly low. Their biggest bat against left-handed pitching is Hanley Ramirez. He basically had a decent game last night. It looks like he's starting to get over that injury, but he's still feeling some effects of it. He's not hitting the ball as hard as he used to. It feels like he's more of like a slap hitter at the moment. I don't know exactly, what is wrong with him. I know he's hurt. I know he's been injured. I know he said he's playing through it. He doesn't look like the same guy right now. So basically you're taking the biggest right-handed bat that they have to attack Happ, and he's probably playing at only 70-75%. Now, if you look at Happ's numbers, I was actually looking at his numbers over on FanDuel. In his last 4 starts, he had 14.33 against Houston, 18.66 against Texas. He threw in a clunker against Houston, who we was seeing for the second time in a week, only put up 6 points in that start. But then he bounced back in his last start with 16 points against Oakland. Now, those are some decent hitting teams that he did that to. Definitely a couple that have been pretty hot lately. And on top of it, this is a guy who, on FanDuel, he's only 7,300. He's pretty cheap over on DraftKings as well. And for the return that he's been giving you, 14.3, 18.6, 16 points, he's giving you more than 2 points per $1,000 of cost, which on FanDuel is exactly what we're looking for. Some of those numbers over on DraftKings were up in the 20 range. He's a little bit below $7,000, I think, on DraftKings. So even that is 3 points per $1,000 of cost, which is, basically going to help you cash in your 50-50s, going to help you win some of those head-to-heads, and is going to give you some good upside in the tournaments that you're in today. So Happ is a guy who has 28 strikeouts in his last 25 innings, and he's going up against a team in Boston that has been striking out a lot against left-handed pitching. They have a 23.5% strikeout rate against left-handed pitching so far this season. So I definitely can see Happ racking up some of those Ks, pitching up in Seattle. Seattle's a very friendly pitcher park. So he's in a good park. He's in a good matchup. He's got, a lot of the numbers going in his way. So he's definitely one of those low-owned guys that I think you compare with Kershaw today, to have a lot of upside. There's a couple other ones, too, that, are also, some of them are even cheaper that make some sense. Carlos Rondon is another one of those guys. He's the stud rookie pitcher from the White Sox. Came out and threw a gem in his first start last time. Basically, last time I had mentioned he's a guy that I liked. He's a guy who I think has all the talent in the world. I just didn't think they were going to let him go deep into that game. And, man, I was wrong. He went out there and threw 104 pitches or something like that and struck out a whole bunch of guys, was just absolutely lights out, completely shut down that offense. So, he's somebody who I think is in play today too. Just like Happ went up against Oakland last time. Oakland doesn't hit left-handed pitching very well. Rondon's a left-handed pitcher. He's going up against that Oakland team. A lot of those big bats on Oakland are left-handed. The guys that they put in for their platoon splits on the right side aren't as good of hitters. Basically, the big right-handed bats that they have when they go up against a lefty are Marcus Semien and Billy Butler. And again, neither one of those guys are really scaring me too much. Butler is more of an average hitter than a power hitter, much as I like Semien usually against left-handed pitching. He's probably not worth the price that they're asking for him today. I think he's actually the most expensive shortstop today on DraftKings, and I think he's either second or third on FanDuel as well. So, going up against a stud rookie who basically was lights out in his first start, I mean, despite the fact that Semien is one of the bigger bats for Oakland, I just can't recommend him today at all. But Rondon is a guy who I think is in play. He's about $5,000 on both DraftKings and FanDuel. So he's definitely, definitely one of those cheap guys that you could pair with Kershaw, and you're still leaving yourself, $33,000 basically on DraftKings to spend on bats, which means that you can take a guy who's over $4,000 at every position and still be fine. So he's another guy I think is in play. Chase Anderson goes up against the Phillies today. He gets a matchup opposite of Billingsley, who has basically been a gas can so far. Billingsley's been getting knocked around in his first 2 starts. I mean, the guy hadn't had a start in over a year and a half. So it's going to take him a little bit of time to knock that rust off. But Chase Anderson's actually been really, really good. I know he's getting a park switch to a better hitter's ballpark, but again, this guy's been good. The Phillies have not been good against right-handed pitching. You know, we've gone over that time and time again, low batting average, least amount of runs scored in the league. And the thing that I find interesting too is their strikeout rate is starting to come up. You know, before they were at like an 18, 19% strikeout rate, and now they're in the low 20s already, like 22, 23. About 24, 25% is something that we want to target because that's rather high on the scale. So the fact that they're creeping up fast there means that they have been striking out a lot in their recent games against right-handed pitching. So I definitely think Chase Anderson is another one of those cheap guys. I think he's 6,000 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel, something around there. So he's another one of those cheap guys that you might want to look at. The last guy that I'm going to talk about is somebody who I really like, and I think that he's going a little bit too untalked about already this morning, and that's Jake Odorizzi. Started the season out absolutely on fire. The thing that helps Odorizzi is he's a high strikeout pitcher. And he's going up against the Minnesota Twins today, whose numbers on the surface don't look horrendous. But again, if you really dig into it start by start, they've had some big scoring outputs against some really bad pitchers that kind of mask the fact that when they go up against some of the better pitchers, they've given up some of the biggest fantasy scores to pitchers so far this year. In the last 2 weeks, there's been at least 4 pitchers that have gone over 22 points against the Twins. And that's because there's been a lot of strikeouts. They've limited the hits. They've limited the runs. You know, some of those guys in the Twins are a little bit free swinging, so they don't give up a lot of walks. They don't walk a ton. And again, like I said, you want to try to find things that are true that other people have overlooked. And if all you're doing is looking at the season stats for Minnesota, they don't look horrible. But if you look at some of those game logs, they haven't really been all that great in some of those games. So that's basically, my rundown on some of the pitchers who I'm going to be using and looking at. I'm actually going to kick it over to my partner, Josh, right now. I know he's got, a lot more information on some of these guys to go over. So, Josh, do you want to get into pitching and see if you can, keep your streak going with nailing the guys everyone should be using?
I think the first guy you got to look at for pitching today is no farther than Clayton Kershaw. Obviously, you discussed he's one of the better pitchers in baseball. You don't have to talk about how good he is or why he's good because at this point everyone knows how good a pitcher he really is. He has excellent stuff. But the problem is he hasn't been great so far this year, and that's something that some people are worried about. Part of the thing that I like to look at with him is the fact that he has an ERA over 4, so his price is going to be a lot lower than what it normally would be. You'll see if Kershaw goes on a run of 3 or 4 good starts, his price on DraftKings will start creeping into the high 12,000s, and sometimes that just becomes too high. And because at some point you can't just put in a whole bunch of hitters that are 2,500 because not a lot of those guys hit towards the top of the order. But for right now, Kershaw's price, I think, is a guy that you have to build around in your 50-50s and your head-to-heads. The reason why I like him today is because obviously he's the best pitcher on the slate, but the Rockies are actually a good matchup against left-handed pitching. Of course, you think about Tulowitzki, you think about Arenado, Blackman, Dickerson, and even Carlos Gonzalez, and you start to think about a really good lineup that can really mash the ball against any pitcher. But they're away from Coors Field today. They're in Los Angeles, so that hurts them a little bit. And against left-handed pitching, the Rockies are slugging just .362, which means they're getting just about 0.3 of a base every single time that they get up to the plate, which is a lot lower. About my threshold for slugging percentage is around 400. If they're below that, then it's a good target in addition with the batting average and K rate, which the Rockies are striking out a lot against left-handed pitchers. And if you guys have seen Kershaw pitch, that's exactly what he does. He strikes out a lot of hitters. Part of the things that I talked about earlier with Kershaw's dip in price, that allows you to fit more bats than you normally wouldn't be able to. So I hate to say Kershaw is a value at his price, but considering his talent and what he can do, he's worth paying up for, especially in your 50-50s and head-to-heads. And although in tournament games, I think a lot of people will have him, so it might be worth staying away. But for now, I'm just going to go with him in all my 50-50s and head-to-heads on one pitcher sites. But on DraftKings, you're going to have to fit in a little bit of a cheaper pitcher, maybe in the second option or some cheaper hitters. Another pitcher that I do like, I believe Benny touched on him a little bit, is Bartolo Colon. I'm not a huge fan of his just because when you watch him pitch, it doesn't quite make sense, but you can't argue with the results that this guy has been good for 2-3 years now with the new approach to pitching. And that new approach basically seems to not throw a ball. He's throwing a strike almost close to 80% of the time. I think he's walked maybe 1 or 2 hitters so far this year, and which is just incredible. And what that does is it gives him the ability to go deeper into games. when you look at a lot of pitchers like Trevor Bauer, Carlos Carrasco, these guys have great stuff and they have high potential to get a lot of strikeouts. But part of the thing that happens with them is they're running up these 2-2 counts. These guys are fouling pitches off, and they end up getting a strikeout, but with an 8 or 9 pitch at bat. And that limits them going in deep to the games. They can only go 5 or 6. One of the things with Colon is why I like him in 50-50s and head-to-heads is because he gives that ability to go deep into a game, be the pitcher of record. He has 6 wins already this year. But what he's able to do is he has 80 pitches in the 7th. He's going to come back out in the 8th or possibly the 9th. And if you get a pitcher that goes that long, there's more opportunities for strikeouts and outs, and that just translates to more fantasy points. That's one of the reasons why I like pitchers like him. Now, although he's kind of bothers me with the way that his success has been, it doesn't really have great stuff. He just pounds the strike zone. You can't argue with the results, and that's exactly what we're targeting in daily fantasy baseball. He goes against the Brewers, who have yielded one of the better performances to pitchers all year, like Bennett just talked about with the Twins. They're hitting just .237 against righties. The strikeout rate is over 20, which hits both at the thresholds I look at for opposing starting pitchers. And we talked about with Colon's ability to pitch to contact. So even if he doesn't get 5 or 6 Ks, if he only ends up with 3 or 4, it doesn't necessarily kill you, because if he's getting 7 or 8 innings, those extra outs are going to make up for the ability in your 50-50s and head-to-heads, because you're not necessarily looking for 30 or 40 points on DraftKings out of your pitcher, but you just can't have less than 20. And that's one of the big reasons why Colon in your 50-50s and head-to-heads is a good idea, because he's going to get to 20 more likely than not. And that's a big thing to pair with if you can fit him in with Kershaw. So there's some one other guy I like to use in my 50-50s and head-to-heads today, and that's Dallas Keuchel against the Blue Jays. He didn't originally show up on my research, but you can't argue what this guy's done this year and last year. He's one of the highest ground ball rates that I think I've ever seen. Right now it's about 63%. Now, a lot of people will say that's unsustainable, and of course you could say that with a small sample size this year. But last year he had a 63% ground ball rate as well. And one of the reasons why I like ground balls so much is you always follow the game of baseball, and you watch more often than not, a ground ball ends up in an infielder's glove, and they're able to throw a guy out at first. And even if there's a guy on first, you can throw a double play, and that's 2 outs with 1 pitch. And what Keuchel's been able to do is limit those opposing hitters from hitting the ball on the nose and hitting fly balls that could go out of the ballpark. So why I like him, because he just misses the barrel of the bat all the time, and that's exactly why he's been so successful. Now, in the past, he hasn't been a huge strikeout guy. He's at a strikeout rate of close to 18%, 17%. But this year, it's close to 20, which is the highest it's been in the major league in his major league career. He had some minor league seasons, which were up over 20%, but they're facing an entirely different caliber of hitter. But why I like Keuchel today is because he faces the Blue Jays, who, of course, you think about Edwin Encarnacion, Jose Bautista, Reyes when he's healthy. But these guys aren't hitting as well as you'd like to think. Guys like Devin Travis at the top of the order, they can do some damage against left-handed pitching. But Keuchel has that changeup, and this is probably you guys are hearing me talk a lot about changeups and a lot about left-handed changeups against right-handed bats. But you can't argue against it, because they do a ton of damage. And although it's Keuchel's 3rd pitch, he uses it a lot to right-handed batters. And with that right-handed heavy lineup in Toronto, you're going to see that pitch a lot today, which I think could get him a few strikeouts. Now, there are 3 guys that I want to talk about for tournament plays. I don't like them in 50-50s for one reason or another, and that's one of the first guys is Odorizzi, which you heard Benny just talk about against the Twins. Now, he is a very good strikeout pitcher. He has good stuff. The Twins have a low batting average and a high strikeout rate. Those are the thresholds and the points that he does hit for me. But he does not a guy that I like to target a lot, because, as you guys know, I like to target guys that throw a lot of ground balls. He doesn't do that. He's close to about a 39% ground ball rate, about a 38% fly ball rate, which he's given up 1 ground ball and 1 fly ball, as his ratio is right around 1. So what that means is, even though hitters aren't really necessarily crushing the ball off him, I believe he has an ERA below 3 this year, they're hitting a lot of fly balls, which means that in a lot of parks and a lot of major league stadiums, if the wind's blowing out or if a guy just gets under it, that ball can still carry a lot farther. And there's only 3 outfielders and a lot more space out there. And it just translates to a lower percentage of outs for me. And that's one of the reasons why I like to target ground ball guys. And that's the only reason I can't use Odorizzi in my 50-50s and head-to-heads, because I feel like, personally, guys that are fly ball pitchers are more prone to having to blowing up and giving up big days. He's been successful because he has these three pitches. You hear me talk about when guys have fastball, cutters, and changeups, which means he can throw the ball into lefties and away from righties and vice versa with those two pitches. But the fact that he gives up a lot of fly balls scares me. We just did talk about his strikeout rate makes him a good tournament option. But for me, I can't pair him with a Keuchel or a Kershaw in my 50-50s and head-to-heads. The last guy I wanted to talk about was R.A. Dickey against the Astros. Now, knuckleballers are interesting because it's either they have it or they don't. A lot of guys, Red Sox fans, have seen Tim Wakefield for a long time. There were guys for the Braves, the Negro brothers, I think they were. They threw some very good knuckleballs as well. And when you look at knuckleballers, the old adage is if it's high, let it fly. If it's low, let it go. And that's one of the things the Astros will definitely look to target against Dickey because they're one of the most aggressive hitting teams in baseball. That's why they strike out a lot. That's also why they hit a lot of home runs. I believe if they're not first, they're in the top 3 in home runs. One of the things that I like to target against right-handed hitters and right-handed pitchers is that strikeout rate, and we know to this point that the Astros are very high. But as a knuckleballer, we always talk about they either have it or they don't. I just mentioned that. If a knuckleballer is off for a given day, it's not even close. It's 2 innings, 3 innings, 9 earned runs, 10 earned runs. There's no medium for that. And that's the reason why I don't think you can play a knuckleballer like Dickey in your 50-50s and head-to-heads. But he's a good option in tournaments because he can get those 10 strikeouts if that knuckleball is flying. Now, for a knuckleballer, another thing you want to look at is the weather. If there's a high humidity or a lot of wind, that knuckleball is going to be dancing a lot. That's what it does by nature. There's no spin, so it's subject to any path of wind, heat, cold, no matter what it is. It's just a ball floating in the air. That's really what it comes down to. Now, the Astros in Houston is very humid, but those doors are closed, so be sure to keep that in mind. If you hear that the Astros tend to open their roof today, I think Dickey becomes even more of a play. I know this is reaching a little bit for factors, but with a knuckleballer, you got to take everything into account because it's not a normal pitch, and R.A. Dickey's not a normal pitcher. That pretty much brings me to the end of my pitching segment for the guys that I want to use. I just wanted to mention a real quick guy that I'm going to stay away from today, and that's Michael Pineda. The guy has been incredible this year. You just saw he had 16 strikeouts against the Orioles in his last start. He had over 40 fantasy points on DraftKings, over 20 on FanDuel, and he's really been excellent. It definitely looks like the Yankees are starting to win that trait for Jesus Montero at this point. So what Pineda's been able to do is get a lot of strikeouts and pitch 6 or 7 innings. Problem is, if he's not striking guys out, he's not worth a lot. And that's why I don't like him today because he goes against the Kansas City Royals, who strike out the least against right-handed pitchers in the major leagues. That about wraps up my pitching segment for today. Benny, do you have anything to add on anything that I was just talking about?
No, I actually agree 100% with a lot of the guys that you talked about that you wanted to start. Pineda is actually the biggest fade that I have as well. The one that I thought was a little interesting that you may need to sell me on is Dallas Keuchel. I don't know, man. Those right-handed bats for Toronto are a little bit scary to me with him. Why do you think he's going to be able to neutralize that? That's my only question, really.
Yeah, it was just more about his changeup. He's throwing it a little bit more this season. I think that's it's a big pitch for him. Now, it's the fact that he's only thrown it about 15% of the time does cause me to be a little bit weary, but I think that's just more of a matchup thing because he throws his cutter a lot. It's not often that a left-hander is going to be throwing a lot of cutters to right-handed hitters because if he doesn't get it in on him, it's right out over the middle of the plate. So I think personally he's going to use that changeup more today to try to neutralize those right-handed hitters. But I just can't go away from how high that ground ball rate is, especially if he gets guys on base. One ground ball is 2 outs, and all of a sudden, once he gets through the meat of that order, that bottom of the order isn't very impressive with guys like Ryan Goins. And Chris Colabello has been good so far, but he's not an excellent hitter. They have guys at the bottom like Ezekiel Carrera. That bottom of the order is where he could get those Ks. And I think if he can use his changeup effectively in the top, he can really put up a good day today.
All right, fair enough. So there you guys have it. From our pitching guru, that's the rundown of some of the guys today. As you can see, I had more guys than I usually do mention. Josh had more guys than he usually mentions. There's a lot of ways you can go with pitching today, especially with Kershaw on top. There's a lot of different guys that you could pair with him, and I think you're going to see a lot of that tonight because I do think that Kershaw is going to be pretty highly owned in that matchup. So that kind of wraps it up for our pitching for today. We're going to move on to our hitter segment. While we're doing our hitter segment, I'm also going to throw in a little bit of a teaching point today on GPP plays versus cash game plays. We have talked about it before, but we're going to be getting a little bit more into it because we had a couple of questions in the forum that a couple of our users had thrown out there. that all basically boils down to, how do I know someone's a GPP play or a cash game play or a guy that I could use in both? So I'm going to try to clear up some of those questions here today while we have, while we have a little bit of time. And then, as always, Josh and I will get into who we're using as our cornerstones. So, excuse me. Let's start it off with catchers. First off, I'm going to give you 2 catchers today. If you're playing on DraftKings, the guy I think that you should be using is Carlos Santana. Santana he's been moved up in the order lately, so he's hitting second. He's a right-handed bat going up against a left-handed pitcher, which is his preferred split. And he's now hitting in front of Michael Brantley, who has been absolutely on fire. So Santana should have a chance to see a few more pitches. They're going up against Wandy Rodriguez, who, again, I realize that Rodriguez went out and threw a gem last time, but I'm not completely sold that this guy's going to be able to do that again. Last year, he got shelled. He was a guy who we targeted against in almost every one of his starts. He's now moved over to Texas, which is still a hitter's ballpark, so it's not like he's getting a park downgrade by going and pitching in Texas. But at the same point in time, again, he's always struggled with those right-handed bats. He's always struggled with right-handed bats that have power. And if you look at that Cleveland order, really the only right-handed power bat that they have is Carlos Santana. Now, on DraftKings, he's still listed as a catcher. And I think that's a big deal because on FanDuel, he's a first baseman, which would be good for your tournaments today because he should go under the radar and lower owned with all the other options over there. But on DraftKings, if you can use a guy like that as a catcher, and I feel like today's a pretty weak day for catchers. You'll see there's one other guy I'm going to mention, but excuse me. A lot of guys who everybody's been using lately, guys like Stephen Vogt doesn't have a really good matchup today. Posey doesn't have a great matchup today. There are a lot of guys who are usually highly owned that aren't really in the best spots today. And because those guys aren't in the best spots, I think you got to look to go a different way. So if you're on DraftKings, you can get a guy like Santana in there. Again, hitter's park going up against a lefty like Wandy Rodriguez. From the right side is where he does most of his damage. There's a lot of boxes that check off for him today. So he's going to be my top choice over there. As I said, I think it's a weak position. So if you're playing on FanDuel, as of right now, the guy that I've been using is Yasmani Grandal. He has a righty-lefty split, goes up against Jesse Hahn of Oakland. That game is at home in Dodger Stadium. Grandal usually hits 5th or 6th in that lineup, especially when they play right-handed pitching because he's a left-handed bat. He's been doing all right this year. He's got like a 298 batting average, a 917 slugging percentage. He's not a bad cash game play, but I feel like he really lacks that elite upside to get you over the hump in a GPP. He's not a guy who ever really does something like Derek Norris did last night where he goes for 30 DraftKings points. He's not even a guy like Willen Rosario who I can say when he has that good, splits matchup righty-lefty, he's a high probability for a home run, whether he's at home or away. And again, they're playing in Dodger Stadium, so it's not like that's a great hitter's ballpark where the ball's going to be flying out today. The wind is blowing out a little bit there. That might help him a little, but basically, like I said, he's the best house on the bad block for me on FanDuel. But if I saw some value open up later on, or if I see that there's a catcher in a pretty good matchup who's getting better lineup placement than he usually does, I could be easily persuaded on FanDuel to come off him. On DraftKings, though, I really like Santana. I even would use Santana a little bit at first base on FanDuel where he's eligible there. So I definitely think he's a good play if you're playing on DraftKings. I'm not sure if he's catcher eligible on Aces still, but if he is, he might be good over there. Like I said, if not, it might be one of those days where you try to find the cheaper option. Somebody batting in the top 6 that has a good splits matchup in a good hitter's ballpark. I just really don't like the catcher position all that much today. I don't think there's a lot of value as of now with the guys that that I normally use. So that's my thoughts on catcher. We're going to move on to first base. There's always a lot of first base options, but I'm going to throw out a couple of them for you, and it's going to actually bring us into our teaching point. So one of the guys who I've been using for tournament rosters so far today is Chris Davis. He gets a matchup against Jared Weaver. Weaver's a right-handed pitcher. Doesn't really have his best stuff. They were actually congratulating him for getting his fastball up to 89 miles an hour in his last start. Now, his last start, he was lights out. I think he finished with like 35 DraftKings points. Went a complete game, was striking guys out, was, really limiting hitters, keeping guys off balance. But I don't really expect him to do that again. He has a tough matchup today in Baltimore against a Baltimore team that, is pretty solid hitting. They have actually struggled a little bit lately, but they do have some pretty nice bats up on top of that order that we're going to mention today who profile as guys who should do pretty well against Weaver. And top of that list is Chris Davis. Davis is a left-handed power bat. He hits much better at home in Baltimore than he does when he's on the road, and he hits much better against right-handed pitching than he does against left-handed pitching. So it's basically set up as the perfect matchup you'd want to put in there for him. He's a high strikeout guy, which is something you always got to worry about. But Weaver is not really somebody who's a high strikeout guy at the moment right now pitching. So I think he might have a little bit of trouble finishing off a batter like Chris Davis, who is, basically so good and has so much power from that left side against right-handed pitching. And again, Baltimore's a great place to hit for him for some reason. Well, not even for some reason. It's a great place to hit. And that's the reason why he hits better when he's at home in Baltimore. It's more comfortable there. It's a good hitter's park for him. It favors those left-handers. So Chris Davis is definitely somebody who I think is in play. Now, again, I said this is going to bring us into our teaching point for today. The teaching point that we want to go over today is the difference between a GPP play, meaning, guys that you would play in one of these big tournaments, and a cash game play, meaning the guys that you want for your 50-50s and your head-to-head games. And here's basically the way that I break it down. I tell people the two things that you want to look at when you're looking at a guy for a GPP versus a cash game is consistency versus upside. Now, let's take upside first, because I think that one's a little bit easier to explain. And it kind of goes hand in hand with a guy like Chris Davis. Now, Davis is not a guy who goes out there every game and gets you 3 for 4, 2 for 4, 2 for 3 with a walk. He's not one of those guys who's going to have a huge high on base percentage. He's basically a guy who can match the ball. He either hits a home run, he hits a long double into the gap, or he strikes out. He probably has as many games where he goes 0 for 3 with a couple strikeouts as he does where he goes 2 for 3 with a home run and a double and, really, knocks it out of the park. And a guy who's going to have those kind of swings, one game having a home run and a double, finishing with 20, 25 DraftKings points, finishing with 8 to 10 FanDuel points, and then the next game having, an 0 for 4 with 3 strikeouts, putting up a 0 on DraftKings, putting up a negative score on a FanDuel or a Fantasy Aces. That's a kind of guy who has very high volatility. That high volatility, that high upside, that's a GPP play. That's a guy who you want to play in your tournaments, hoping that you pick him on the right day where he does go off and have that double and home run and gives you that kind of upside. So if you have him in his home park against a right-hander who he should be able to profile to do well against, those are the times that you want to use Chris Davis. But again, he's more of a guy who leans towards the tournament side because he has that kind of upside, but he's not very consistent. So let's look at guys on the other side of that coin, the guys who are consistent. A guy like Jose Altuve. Jose Altuve does not have a ton of home run power, but he gets on base a ton because he does get a lot of hits. When he's on base, he can steal, he can score some runs. That's how he racks up his big fantasy point days. Now, if you look at the difference between a guy like Altuve and a guy like Davis on DraftKings has a lot more 0s or 3s or 2s in his game log. A guy like Altuve is consistent with numbers between 8 and 12 almost every game. Occasionally, he will get a hold of one and hit a home run, or he'll have a 2 stolen base game, or he'll have a 4 for 4 game where he gets you 20, 25 points, but it's not his norm. His norm is 1 or 2 hits, 1 or 2 walks, a run scored here or there, an RBI here or there, a stolen base here or there. And at the end of the day, he gets you somewhere around like 10 or 11 or 12 DraftKings points, which again, for a cash game, for a 50-50, for a head-to-head, that's perfectly fine. That's what we want. If we can get a whole bunch of guys who can consistently get us 10 points into our lineups, we're going to get 80 from our hitters. If we can get that 40 to 50 points that we always talk about from our pitching, but we're at 120, 130. That's definitely enough to cash in most of our 50-50s. It's going to win you a higher percentage of your head-to-heads than it loses. And it might even be enough, depending on the night, to sneak you into the back end of some of those, big tournaments that we tell you to throw your cash game lineup into. So those are the kind of guys that you want to help. Other guys that fit into that bill, guys like Matt Carpenter. Carpenter's a guy who gets you 8 to 12 points every game. As you guys know, I have a man crush on him. He, has won me a lot of money playing in head-to-heads. He's somebody who I roster often. Lately, Michael Brantley has been in that same breath. I mean, every game, if you look at this guy's game log, 10 of his last 11 games, he's got at least 10 points. The one game he didn't get 10 points, he finished with 7. He's consistent points that you can put into your roster every day. And he's a guy who falls in the category of GPP play and cash game play. Yesterday, he had a pretty decent matchup, hit a home run, finished with about 18 or 19 DraftKings points. 18 or 19 DraftKings points makes him a play in any format. And he's a guy who falls into both categories. Now, excuse me, guy doesn't have to be in one or the other. A guy like Brantley that has upside, that has power, but is also consistent enough where he's banging out a couple hits every game. He's one of those guys that you can stick into both lineups. You know, Altuve in a good matchup, Carpenter against a right-handed pitcher in a good hitter's ballpark. You know, these are guys who can be a GPP play and also a cash game play. It's not that the two are mutually exclusive. It doesn't need to be one or the other. So for our users who are asking those questions and posting questions about that in the forum, you know, those are the things that we look for when we make these plays. On any given day, as I said to the one user, matchup is what predicts everything. So on any given day, a guy could be a GPP play. He could be a consistent play that you would like to use, or he could fall into both categories. I mean, again, it all depends on who he's going up against, what ballpark he's in, you know, all the other factors that we talk about all the time. So those are just our thoughts on GPP plays versus cash game plays. Hopefully that narrowed it down for some of you guys and gave you a little bit of a better understanding of it. So now we're going to move on and talk about the rest of the plays that we like today. Another guy who I really love at first base is Adrian Gonzalez. Gets a good matchup against Eddie Butler of Colorado. High run total game over there. They're expecting about 9 runs out of that one. Butler is really struggling with left-handed bats. Now, admittedly, it's a small sample size. Butler has only been around in the league for about a year and a half. He probably has less than 100 total innings pitched. But you can start seeing a difference already in his splits. Right-handers don't do very well against him. Left-handers tend to hit him well for average and for power. And if you're talking about left-handed bats on the Dodgers, guys who can hit for average and power, I mean, the one guy who stands out is Adrian Gonzalez. At this point, he's averaging over 4.3 FanDuel points per game, and his price is less than 4,000. His price is less than 5,000 over there. He's basically getting you 1 point per $1,000 of salary that you spend, which works out pretty well for a cash game on FanDuel, especially for a guy who has some upside. Dodgers Park is not a great hitter's park, but again, it's where Adrian Gonzalez has been hitting all year, and he's been hitting well there all year. So it's not really something that's going to scare me off him. His price is a little bit high, which is something that I kind of like because it's going to keep other people off of him, especially in your tournaments. But he's a guy who has that same upside and consistency that makes him a play in a GPP or in a regular cash game. So Adrian Gonzalez, definitely one of those guys I think you should have on your radar today. We're going to move on to second base. I have 2 second basemen that I like today, and both of them are guys who are a little more expensive than they were a couple weeks ago. But the reason for that is the production that they've been. Colton Wong is a left-handed bat, hitting over 320 so far this season, has hits in 8 of his last 10 games. 4 of those games he's actually had multiple hits in. He's had at least 2 hits in 4 of those last 10 games. So he's somebody who's really starting to dial it up a little bit. Big reason why St. Louis is starting to do a little better. They're shuffling their lineup around. You know, guys like Matt Adams who haven't been hitting have been dropped down to like the 6 or the 7 hole. They're starting to move up guys like Hayward, guys like Wong. And I feel like they have a pretty good matchup today after, like I said, after basically having a pretty bad start to the season. One thing that the Cards do pretty well is hit right-handed pitching. Their struggles usually come against left-handed pitching with all the lefties that they have in their lineup. So I definitely think Colton Wong is a decent choice. He's a good choice for your cash game plays. I don't think he has a lead upside, so I don't know if I would be using him, in my tournaments. One guy who I have been using as a tournament play over on FanDuel is Jimmy Paredes. Now, I know that this guy was on fire 2 weeks ago and has kind of cooled off, but if you look at his game logs, he's still giving you positive returns on FanDuel game after game. He hits in a 2 hole, so he has good protection in that lineup. Guys like Adam Jones, guys like Chris Davis hitting right behind him. He's got Machado hitting in front of him right now, who's been on a tear and getting on base. So Paredes, the one thing that he has done very well and that he did very well during that big run that he had about a week or 2 ago is he hits right-handed pitching very well. He's a switch hitter, but I feel like he's kind of better from the left side, and the numbers have already bared that out so far this year. Now, again, he's not a guy who's been an everyday player for a long time, so we don't have a huge track record to go on. But as long as he's hot, as long as he's not too expensive, and as long as he keeps producing you in the upside that he has. So Paredes is another guy I think you can use there at second base if you're looking for somebody else. Moving on to third base today, there's 2 guys that I like. I had Adrian Beltre over David Freese early on, and after seeing the win situation in that Texas game, I think I might actually flip-flop them and put Beltre 2 and Freese up number 1. But let me give you the case for both of them. Beltre goes up against Bruce Chen. Chen's the guy who struggles with right-handed power bats. Beltre bats cleanup. 4 of his last 5 games, he's been able to get a hit. In 3 of those last 5, he's actually been able to get multiple hits. So this is a guy who, after a slow start, is starting to heat up again. Again, he's got the right matchup. He's playing in Texas, which is usually a pretty good hitter's ballpark. You know, the wind is a little bit concerning with me that it's blowing straight in today. But again, it's not like Beltre's a guy that we rely on multiple home runs for. I'm basically banking on him being a good cash game play today, picking up multiple hits against a weak pitcher like Chen. And, you know, in the middle of that order, having a good chance to drive in some runs and score some runs. So Beltre is definitely one of those guys I think you should put on your radar. The guy who I really like, though, is David Freese. Now, he's going up, he's a left-handed batter going up against a right-handed pitcher. Has a .320 batting average with 13 extra base hits and only 100 at-bats last year against left-handed pitching. So the one thing that Freese does really well is hit those left-handers when they come in. His average is down a little bit this year, but he already has 3 home runs and only 23 at-bats against left-handed pitching. So last year he hit for average. This year he's hitting for power. But the point of it all is against left-handed pitching, this guy's hitting. He goes up against Wei-Yin Chen, who here's a little bit of a something that most of you guys probably don't know. I track the moonshot every day. I play in it every day, and I track it to see what kind of guys have been winning large field GPPs. Wei-Yin Chen was actually on 2 moonshot winning rosters last week. He threw a very good game in the one and was a big reason for it. And in the other one, he had a decent game at a really low price and was paired with one of the big studs. And that was how, you know, that roster got to the top. But for a guy to be able to get to the top twice in 1 week on the moonshot, you got to figure that he's been doing some outperforming of where everybody expected him to be. So, again, you know, there is a little bit of downside to this play. Chen hasn't been a gas can. He's been pitching decently. But that game is being played in a good hitter's park in Baltimore. And as I said, Freese is one of those guys who, as a right-handed bat against left-handed pitching, has done nothing but produce. So you really can't argue with him. So we're going to move on to shortstop now. There's a couple of guys that I like. Elvis Andrus is one of those guys. Again, he goes up against the other Chen, Bruce Chen, who struggles with right-handed bats. He's a left-handed pitcher. Andrus is still hitting second in that order. And that order's starting to come around right now. You know, leadoff hitter Shin-Soo Choo, he's finally becoming, you know, more like the guy that Texas thought they were getting when they threw a huge contract at him. You know, same goes for Prince Fielder. He's starting to play more like the guy that they thought they were getting when they traded Kinsler for him. Prince's power hasn't really been there, but he's got a high average right now. He's making contact. He's getting on base. So that top of the order is a lot better than it had been in recent time. And even Beltre hitting behind him. You know, that top of the order has been producing a lot better. So Andrus is a guy who I think can get on base. He can steal some bases. He can score some runs. He's had multiple hits in a couple of his games, and I feel like he's in line to do that again today. Rangers, it was the highest over-under, the highest run line total. The wind, even though it's blowing in, hasn't made Vegas drop that line at all. So I definitely think the Rangers are going to score some runs. And with his lineup placement around all those big bats that have been doing pretty well, you know, I definitely think Andrus is one of those guys at a weak position who can help you get it done. The other guy that has been popping up on all the screeners that we run is Marcus Semien. And I'm not really sure how I want to go with this guy here. Now, Semien hits left-handed pitching very well, but he goes up against Carlos Rondon today, who, like we said, last time in his last start was absolutely lights out. When they play against left-handed pitching, Semien's a guy who usually bats second or third in that order. Again, he's one of the best right-handed bats that they have in Oakland, but I just don't know about this matchup today. I don't know about the matchup. I don't know about the ballpark. There's a lot of knocks on him as well. And the other thing that really has me a little concerned, he was a guy who popped up in my research, so he was on my short list. But when I went over to look at him on the sites, he's 4,300 on DraftKings. He's the second most expensive shortstop on FanDuel. I mean, that's just way too much money to spend for this guy. I don't think he has a ton of upside. He's not a big home run hitter. You know, it's just I feel like his matchup is telling me I should be playing him. But, you know, my brain and my gut are telling me he's a guy I want to stay away from today. So I want to mention him so you guys can look at the same numbers that I looked at. But he's a guy that I've been struggling with knowing which way I want to go on him. He could go out there and have a 20 DraftKings point day, or he could go out there and go 0 for 4 as well. So just keep that in mind if he is somebody that you're looking for. Shortstop is a tough position to fill in. And, you know, like I said, he's one of those guys that I'm a little weary of. Moving on today to outfield, Jason Hayward has been hitting pretty well lately. He's got a good righty-lefty matchup. Again, the rain is starting to scare me a little bit in that game, but if he does get to go, he's been moved up to 4th or 5th in that order. gets a chance to go up against Shane Green. Shane Green is not a horrible pitcher, but he has struggled mightily with left-handed bats. The way Hayward's been hitting, he's now one of the bigger left-handed bats in that order. Had a couple doubles yesterday, has been, putting a couple extra base hits together, has been getting a lot more hits, making a lot better contact. So he's somebody I think you can put in there as well. The one other outfielder that I really want to mention, I love Mike Trout today. I know he's expensive. I know he's not really a value guy. I know he's somebody that's tough to fit in. But if you have money and you can spend up an outfield, Trout going up against Wei Baltimore is a matchup that I'm going to try to exploit. I know that Los Angeles Angels team really hasn't been hitting, but they do decently against left-handed bats. There's a couple guys in that order that can hit lefties. Basically the two guys that I mentioned in Freese and Trout. So they're two guys who I think I'm going to be using as well. And in order to fit in guys like Trout and Kershaw today, we're going to need some cheap options. Some of the other outfielders that have popped up on our radar today, a guy like a David Peralta, who's in a good righty-lefty matchup in a good hitter's park in Philly. He's got some upside today against a guy like Billingsley, who basically has been giving it up to left-handed bats and giving up a lot of home runs to left-handed bats. Peralta should be hitting fourth in the middle of that order, so I definitely think he's in line for a good game. Guys like Ryan Rayburn going up against the lefty today. Guys like Jock Peterson going up against the righty from the left side today. Again, Michael Brantley's been so hot. He's somebody that you have to look at. I don't think that he has a particularly tough matchup today as well. Other guys from Arizona, I think Arizona is going to have an easy time with Billingsley today. So guys like A.J. Pollock, guys like Inciarte, those are guys that I definitely think you might want to keep an eye on as well. A lefty guy like Ethier for Detroit, for the Dodgers, I think he's in play. Diaz at Baltimore, and Kyle Blanks down in Texas. Those are some of the guys, some of the cheaper bats that you can try to fit into your lineup in the outfield in order to be able to get everything going. So that's basically, our rundown of some of the hitters that we like for today. We're going to move on and talk about how we're going to be going about it, building our rosters and attacking the slate. So, Josh, you want to let people know how you're going to be going about it?
Yeah, first things first, on DraftKings, on two pitcher sites like Aces and DraftKings as well. I'm going to be targeting Kershaw, the first guy I'm clicking on, and I'm going to be pairing him with Dallas Keuchel in my 50-50s and head-to-heads. On FanDuel, though, definitely Kershaw in all my 50-50s and head-to-heads, because even if he doesn't have a great game, I think everybody else is going to have him, so it's more of a block thing in addition to the fact that he is the best pitcher for me on today's slate. And in order to fit these top-priced pitchers, I'm going to need some value. Guys like the Ryan Rayburn, if he starts today against a left-handed pitcher. Guys like Kyle Blanks, things of that nature. As for tournaments, I'm looking at lefties, always left-handed hitters and right-handed hitters, actually, against Jared Weaver. I like the Rangers righties against Chen, who you mentioned as well. And also like Dodgers lefties, like Gonzalez, like who you mentioned, Jock Peterson, against left Eddie Butler for right-handed pitcher for the Rockies. Now, for pitchers in tournaments, I think we're going to have some R.A. Dickey. Although he has struggled a little bit this year, he has that upside with that knuckleball against the Astros right-handed pitchers. What are you doing for today in your games?
Well, here it is. I'm basically going to open my playbook for you guys and tell you exactly what I'm doing here, because I think it's pretty easy night to figure out. If you're playing on FanDuel, Clayton Kershaw is the pitcher that you use. He's the pitcher I'm using in cash. He's the pitcher I'm using in a lot of my tournaments. He's far and away the best pitcher. He should have one of the best scores tonight. And over on FanDuel, you really need the guy who's going to be the top scoring pitcher, because if not, then you need your bats to do way too much to make up for it. So you're going to have to find some cheap bats to put in there over on FanDuel, but I think Kershaw needs to be on top of all your lineups. I don't care what site you're playing on. If you're playing in cash games today, I think Kershaw needs to be in your cash game. So on DraftKings, I'll have Kershaw and somebody else, and then I'll come down and try to find some of those cheap bats that Josh was just talking about. Over on Aces, it's even easier to fit him in. If you're playing in cash games over on Aces, the price point, which is something we'll get into on another day, but the price point between the top pitcher on Aces and the bottom pitcher on Aces is a lot closer than it is on a lot of the other sites. There's not as much of a difference between the guys you're paying up for and the guys you're paying down for, but there is still the same difference between the return that they can give you. So over on Aces, whether you're playing in a tournament or in a cash game, I think Kershaw's the first guy you should be plugging in your lineup and then trying to figure out who you put with them and go down from there. On DraftKings, if you're playing in cash games, same thing. Kershaw's the first guy you put in, and then you figure out who you want to pair with them and then go down on your bats. Now, the one place I won't be using Kershaw and the one place where I think you guys shouldn't use them is if you're playing in tournaments over on DraftKings. Now, over on DraftKings, it's not that his price is too high, but he doesn't have a ton of upside at that price. Could he go out there and go 9 innings with 15 strikeouts and throw a no-hitter? Of course, he has that kind of talent, but it's not as likely. You know, he really needs to get you 40-plus points to give you upside for a tournament over on DraftKings. So if there is a place that you're going to be fading Kershaw tonight and not using him, to me, it's in some of the tournaments on DraftKings. Most people are going to be trying to fit him in, so they're not going to have a lot of money to spend up on bats. To me, though, if you're going to try to fit in a Kershaw, you know, a lot of people are going to be doing that. So if you want to differentiate yourself for tournaments, you can go with 2 of the cheaper options that we talked about. Guys like Rondon, guys like Odorizzi, guys like Cologne. You know, there are a lot of other options that you can go with. If you hit on the right 2 guys and they give you that kind of 4 or 5 point per $1,000 worth of cost upside, you're going to basically get as close as you can get to a guy like Kershaw, but you're going to be leaving yourself an extra $7,000 or $8,000 that you can spend on bats. So instead of having to start a guy like a Pollock or a Peralta or an Inciarte from Arizona, you can start Mike Trout. You can start Mike Trout and pair him with Nelson Cruz and pair him with, you know, Michael Brandt. I mean, you could basically fit a whole bunch of studs in your lineup if you take 2 of the cheaper pitchers without Kershaw. So again, it's not something I would do in cash games. It's not something I would do on FanDuel. It's not something I would do on Aces. But if you're playing in some of these tournaments on DraftKings, I definitely think there's some merit to fading a guy like Kershaw. But other than that, he's the cornerstone that I'm building around all my cash game lineups tonight. I'm going to try to get some of those bats that we mentioned earlier today in there, and hopefully that's going to lead me to some money.
That brings us to the end of the show, and it's Friday, everybody. Be sure to get your lineups in. Go out, have a great time tonight. Hopefully, let's make some money. We will be back next Tuesday, May 19th at noon Eastern time. Be sure to use all the RotoCurve tools. It seems like something new is popping up over there every day. I know I'm using it in my research already, and I suggest you guys do as well. They have a nice lineups page. They have MLB scoring leaders. You can check up anything you need to, including even umpire stats. So be sure to take advantage of the things at your disposal. Be sure to follow myself and Benny on Twitter. You can find our links pretty much anywhere on the site. And have a great night. It's going to be a fun one. Kershaw night. Plus, there's a lot of good hitters, a lot of good pitchers. Going to make for a fun slate. I will see you guys next Tuesday. And once again, Benny has one more thing to say. Still working on those T-shirts.
That's right. Stay classy, DFS. We love you guys. Good luck tonight.